Nested components in Adobe XD. Part 2. We're going to design an accordion today. Let's get started. I'm going to drop some text in here. And basically, when you think of an accordion, there's a parent level and then there's a child level. So I'm going to go ahead and create a child level, the elements for that first. Just write out some text. I'm going to change up the font and the point size, and we'll keep it at regular. We'll change it to black. I'll zoom in a little bit here. And now we need a background for that item. It's going to show up kind of like in a list. So I'm just going to draw out a rectangle here. I'm going to group the two and turn it on padding, and then drop the padding way down. Let's say height 40. That's pretty good. Okay, now I'm gonna ungroup it. So I want this to be, let's go with 320 wide. Now for the child item, I'm gonna use the auto height text field. So basically you're gonna have the full width of this to rename the child item here. And to create a little bit of visual hierarchy, what I'm going to do is in the child item, the padding on the left is going to be increased more than what the parent item looks like, and this will probably make a little bit more sense once you see the two side by side. So I'm going to say, all right, this is the full width, but I want maybe 12 pixels padding. I don't know, for the parent is going to be 12, so I'll do another. So 24 for the child. So you could imagine this is the child, the parent will look something like this, and we'll change the text style too. But we'll do that in a minute. So we've got our label here, and I'm going to go ahead and change that, the layer name to label, and change this to background. And what we're actually going to do is a little trick that I like to do for hover states, especially if it's like menu items like this, is most people would take both of these, right, group them together, or just turn it into a component. And now if you want it to be, since this will be a web view, you want to be able to do a hover interaction on this, right? So most people would say, okay, here's the hover state, and change that to, whatever. That's really ugly. So now you've got your little menu item. You drag out a copy, use it, somewhere. Well, the label's not going to be child item, right? It'll be, something realistic. Let's say it's for a car website or something. So interior color is what your menu item is going to be. Well, since you created this with the background and the label together, when you go to switch the hover state, your text label resets. So basically you have to go into multiple states in order to change just the text. There's not really a good way to override that. So instead of doing that, what I do is, if it's only a simple hover state that we're trying to mimic, is I'll create the background as the component that has the default hover states. And that way you don't have to go into multiple states to change that label. So we'll do that right here. Actually, I'm going to delete that component, so I don't want that one in there. So let's say in the child level, it's got a little bit of gray to it, something like that. That's going to be our default state for the background. And background, yep. Okay, so now we'll turn that into a component. Now, what I'm actually going to do is, just to make it a little bit easier to understand what I'm doing, I'm going to leave the default state as is. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to create, because there's going to be a child and a parent, and I want to use basically the same background, but just change the colors a little bit. I'll create basically 4 different states for this background. One will be the default state for the child and the hover state for the child item. The other 2 would be the default and hover states for the parent item. So child default is going to be this one. Child hover. And basically I'm just going to make it just a little bit darker. So now I'll do the parent. And the parent hover. And again, this will just be a little bit darker. Something like that. So we cycle through these here: child default, child hover, parent default, parent hover. And this will make a lot more sense once they're actually stacked up next to each other. So I'll switch it to the child default state, and I don't really want to use the main component for this, so I'm just going to get rid of it. Adobe XD would actually do that for you if you used main component inside of another component. If you nested inside there, it would actually swap it out and give you the instance instead, so you're not constantly editing the main component. So these 2 now I'm going to group, and I'm going to rename that to child item. And now I'm going to group it again and call it children, and turn on a stack here. We want a vertical stack, so now I'm going to go into the stack, and I'm just going to duplicate this a few times and tighten up the spacing. I'm just going to have them stack right on top of each other. So there's our children, and now we can actually just, oops, paste a version of that, and we'll call that the parent. And we'll go into the background and make sure that we change it to the parent default. Remember, with the parent, we want to tighten up the spacing so it gives you a little bit of a hierarchy. So we'll just say I want to do this. Okay. And we'll change the font style from regular, and we'll just use medium. Okay. So now if you look at the layer stack, we've got parent, and there's a stack is the children, and a handful of child items inside here. Okay. We're actually going to go back to, you can click any of the instance components because we forgot to wire up the hover. You can use Adobe XD's default hover state. That's kind of like a shortcut for you that'll actually do the wiring. I usually don't because by default it sets it to auto animate. And which is fine a lot of the time, but for something like this, I just want it to happen quickly, right? Because it's just a hover state. So I just want it to be a transition with, zero delay or anything like that. So I didn't use the automatic wiring, so I need to go back and do that wiring. So I'm going to right click on it and hit edit main component. And we'll start with a child. So in the default state, when we hover, instead of auto animate, we're going to do transition. And we want the child hover state. And no animation. There we go. Now for the parent, we want the hover transition, but now we want to go to the parent hover. And we'll set this back to child default. We should be good there. Okay. So parent and child, we're going to take these two groups and group them, and we'll just call it a section. And we're going to turn a stack on here, and it's going to be 0. It recognized that basically there's two groups stacked right on top of each other, so by default, when you check the stack, it made it a vertical stack. And now we're just going to go back and hide this, because by default we're going to see a list of the parent items. Actually, I need to change that to parent. And then you're going to click on each individual one to open it. So there we go. So now we've got one section ready. And we haven't set up any interactions yet because we're going to nest this into a larger component that is the entire accordion. So now we need to create a couple more sections. So basically I'll just hit Command G to group. And I'll call this sections. I'll turn on a stack for this. Now there's only one item inside that group, so Adobe XD didn't really know what to do with it, so it just by default put it in horizontal stack. I'm just going to change that to vertical. So now I'm going to duplicate out a couple sections. 3 should be fine. And then we'll set the spacing to 0 so they're right on top of each other. So even now, if we preview this, it's got the hover for the parent items. If you could see the children items, then it would have that hover already built into. So now we need to build the interactions of actually expanding each section. So what we're going to do, this is going to be our component, right? So we'll turn this into a component, and all the states will be built into this component. So we've got 3 sections. Only one section can be open at a time. So basically we need a default, which is what we've got here. We need section 1 open, section 2 open, section 3 open. So we'll have 4 different states. So I'll add a new state here. Section 1 open. And actually I'll just create all of them right here. Section 2 open. And section 3 open. Okay. So starting with section 1 open, we're going to go into section 1 and turn on the children. And we're in a stack now, so it actually rearranged everything for us. Now I can go into section 2 and show the children, and go into section 3 and show the children for that one. Okay. So now we need to wire it all up. Okay. So we'll switch over to prototype mode, and you can see the little hover wires are already there. Now what we need to do is the actual clicks. So on section 1, when we're in the default state for the parent component, make sure we change this to tap. For this one, we could try auto animate and see how it looks. We can always come back and change it. So auto animate, and the destination is going to be section 1 open. We'll just leave the easing and the duration what it is for now. Then we'll repeat that process for section 2 and 3. Just make sure we change the destination up. Okay, so now in section 1, when we click on this parent level, we want this to collapse, so we would be back to the default state. So tap, auto animate again, and back to the default state. Section 2 is going to go to section 2, and section 3 to section 3. And basically we're just going to repeat that process. So we should be all set here. So we'll hit play to preview. And there's our hover interaction. If we click on one, it expands it. The bottom one moved down, and you can see all the child items already have that hover in place. There you go.